Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's October 3rd, 2021, and today we are speaking about a new Myanmar-related podcast that started in July this year, the Anah Conversations with Myanmar podcast, with its two hosts, Suzanne and Ruth. So we can identify your voices. Hello, Suzanne.
Hello, how are you?
Very well, and hello, Ruth.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Great to meet you both. I listened to your introductory episode when it came out, and you said you started the podcast partly because Western media had grown mostly silent over the ongoing political troubles and conflict in Myanmar since the first February military coup. So what is the mission of the Anah podcast?
Well, me and Suzanne were just talking constantly about it and going through this emotional turmoil because of our friends, because this country that we were we fell in love with. And it was on the news initially when the coup first happened, and it was all pot banging and everyone knew about it. And then it just, all these terrible things were happening. And I was hearing about them from friends. I was seeing them on Facebook, and it just wasn't making the news. I was just absolutely appalled that this could be happening in the world, and I have to actively go out of my way to try and find out about it. And we just wanted to make sure that people could love this country as much as we do by hearing the voices of the people who are going through this awful time. So I don't know whether you want to carry on, Suzanne.
Yeah, I mean, we have some people who work on this, obviously, that are Myanmar as well, whose identity we will not reveal for their own safety and security. But one of those people, we were chatting and I said, I'm thinking about maybe doing a podcast and maybe trying to let people know a bit more. And this person got so motivated by this that I kind of felt I had to do it. I was almost I'm going to have to follow through on this now because this person has so much hope in this idea. And I think it kind of came from there. And as Ruth said, we're spending all of our time just constantly talking about Myanmar to each other. It's we may as well just, make this a thing. And I think I found that people were interested. When people, obviously I'd moved back to Ireland, I hadn't lived here for a long time. And, the first thing, small talk, oh, where were you? What were you doing? And then you mentioned Myanmar, they're where? Where's that? Never heard of it. You say Burma, if they're old, they might have heard of that. If they're young, still don't know what you're talking about. Then they would ask you and you would say what happened and why I had to leave. And people were interested. I don't think it was fair to say people don't care what's happening in other parts of the world. I think that's a misconception in the media. I think we're far more globally minded than people give us credit for, especially the younger generation. So I felt if I could get these stories to people here, that they would care if they had the opportunity to listen. And I think so far that's proven correct because we're finding so many people who didn't know Myanmar before reaching out to us, listening to the podcast and really being moved by the people that we're talking to. So in that sense, yeah, I think it has been successful.
And what drove you to take the format of interviewing people and mostly letting them give their own kind of thoughts and perspective? For example, you could have done a, news roundup and given your perspectives every week on what was happening, etc. Why did you choose this interview format?
For me,
I think we're not experts. That's number one.
Yeah.
No, it's okay, Ruth. Did you want to go? But I think we didn't want to be those annoying people who come on and talk just the two of them all the time about their that's not our idea of something we would like to listen to. No offense to people who do that, but and it was to give voice to those who can't speak. A podcast is a safer way. We can hide their faces, we can hide their identity. So it was safe. It can be downloaded to be listened to offline because obviously in Myanmar we're internet cuts and people in remote areas. A lot of people now have joined ethnic groups and they're in very remote areas. So that they were all factors. And we wanted it to be a two-way conversation. We wanted information to go into the country too, as much as come out, because there's so many initiatives happening outside that they don't know about. So if there's a huge protest or there's an art exhibition or there's a fundraiser, people care. We wanted them to know that outside people care too. So I think that was the conversational element of stories coming in and out. Sorry, Ruth, did you want to add to that?
No, you actually you said exactly what I was going to say. I'm learning through this. I'm not an expert in Myanmar history. I don't speak the language fluently. I can't read Burmese. So in terms of like being in the country when the Rohingya genocide, was in the forefront of the news in the Western media, there was a lot of fake news going around as well in Myanmar and the way that it was reported. I feel like I couldn't be the person to report back the situation because I wasn't able to fully investigate, fully question. So I would not be prepared to be a news source on Myanmar, someone outside the country, someone who, I rely a lot on my friends who can translate for me and tell me the information. And we'd much rather hear from them. Not that everyone's on the show's been our friend. We like to think they're our friends afterwards. But having the people who are living through it, who've experienced it, and the experts who have, it's their job to be experts on it, speak is just, I think, a much better thing than us giving our opinion.
And why did you call it ahnah?
The idea of ahnah, a concept in Burmese culture that we've always really liked. It's this kind of beautiful thing they have of being selfless and putting others above themselves. And I think that there was no English equivalent. You couldn't translate it, which I thought was really great. It was a unique word for Myanmar, a Myanmar word, but also it sounds like English words like nah, and if we don't want to do something like nah, or ah, so we kind of thought it was a nice play on our language as well. And then in terms of it, like there's lots of definitions of ahnah, and I'm not going to offer one. There's so many different interpretations, but at the heart of all interpretations, there is this sense that you put others' interests above your own. And we saw that a lot in Myanmar. And as a teacher, my students never questioned me or challenged me, which I found really strange, and I would try and encourage them to don't just accept what I'm telling you. But it was their respect for me and my position. And I was always worried about how someone in power could take advantage of that kind of cultural idea, and then when we kind of looked at it in a political context, and we thought how that could lead to silence and inaction in terms of people not speaking out because somebody has a position higher than them. And then if you look at that in terms of the military and this regime that could use that to their advantage in terms of having people beneath them not question them and be obedient. So they were kind of our thoughts along the word and why we would use it. But again, we allow people's own interpretation. People have said it sounds very like one of the words in coup. And they thought that was the word we were using, which we thought, well, that's kind of cool as well. So there's a few different things we've heard from people, and other people have given us their interpretation, which is a lot stronger than our intended meaning. But I think Christina Fink mentions it in her book, Living in Silence. And there is also a really good study that was done a few years back by Sarah Becker, and it's in a book edited, it's Essays on Burma, edited by John Ferguson. That I would recommend anyone to read that if they want to know more about this term, ahnah. But yeah, I don't want to over-explain it. But yeah, there was a bit of talk on into it anyway. We didn't just pluck it out of nowhere.
Yeah, it's a great name, and that's a great explanation as well. You just mentioned, Suzanne, that you were a teacher in Myanmar and that you were living there when the coup happened. Maybe, did you want to share something of your experience teaching in Myanmar and then deciding to leave after the coup and what you saw?
Yeah, we had already been online since March 2020 teaching because of COVID. So I teach in an international school, so a British international school, not the British one. And so we were teaching online, and leading up to the coup, I think I remember the Friday, it kind of made the news. And I didn't read a lot of news in Myanmar, but when COVID happened, I read it more regularly just for kind of, what were the rules at the moment? What was the curfew? What could I do or couldn't do? So I was reading it kind of daily just for those updates. And then this talk of this coup. And I remember messaging a few friends and saying, should I be concerned? And they were like, I think you should. Yeah, this is very possible. So nobody was saying to me, no, like in Western media, they were saying, no, this is not going to happen. But people I spoke to were saying, yeah, you should really, start to take this seriously. So we kind of did. We went out, and that Saturday, we walked the whole city. I think we said goodbye to Yangon. I think deep down, we kind of had a feeling we might not see it again. And we went all around. We went down to Choy-Dagan. We just visited all the places that we hadn't seen for a long time. And then Monday morning, we woke up, and I do this thing at night where I always turn my phone on airplane mode because people don't remember time differences and they just message or ring in the middle of the night. So when I woke up, obviously I hadn't clicked the Wi-Fi, so messages had come through. So there was loads of messages say it's happening. But our internet was gone. And then we realized very quickly our Wi-Fi was still working, but the data was gone. So then we were just trying to message as many people as possible because we didn't know who had internet and who didn't. So we're the only ones in the whole country with internet. We better get information out fast. So then we were just messaging. I think Ruth would have got loads of these messages. In case you never hear from us again, this is what's happening. And we just tried to get that out. But we had to continue as usual in work. Like, you know, it was some people had gone into work that day because some were still working from in the building. Many of us were still working at home. And then I guess it was just a waiting game. Nobody kind of knew what to do. We turned on the TV. There was nothing. It was just blank. And then eventually we just left it on. And then MRTV came on and we saw the newsreader read the news. So we just videoed it. We didn't know what he was saying because obviously my Burmese is not there at all. I'm not even going to say not that good. It's non-existent. So we videoed it and then we sent it to friends who translated it and explained what had happened. And then, we continued teaching the whole time. I never stopped our work for the whole time. And even when I left 3 weeks later. So we had a week's holiday, which was why I left when I did, because I had more time to move within that space. Some left earlier, some left later. We continued and I saw out my contract until June this year, working nights from Ireland. So I worked 2 a.m. to 9 a.m. for months because, you know, they needed to get their education and their results and their exams. We couldn't just leave them. So even though many of us left, all of us actually in the end left the country, you know, we didn't leave our jobs, and some people are still working there online now. But I finished my contract and don't work there anymore, which is why the podcast started in July, because under my contract, I couldn't speak about anything that was happening in the country publicly. As most people expats who work in Myanmar, that would be in your contract. And in most countries, even I worked in China previously, it was always in my contract as well. So the podcast started later than we would have liked because of my contract.
Great. That's a really interesting, fascinating story. And that must have been really hard work doing those nights. I can't even imagine that. And it has been really tragic hearing from, for example, university lecturers and staff who are doing CDM and still trying to graduate their students, and this kind of shadow education economy cropping up. And, you know, just one of the many sad things that you reminded me of then. You brought up the podcast again, explaining why you started it in July. So let's talk about it a bit more. You know, the show is mostly interviews, as we've said, with people prominent in resisting the coup. And you've put out, I think, 15 episodes so far. I wanted to ask the two of you if you wanted to share a few of your favorites for us. Tell us which episodes you recommend and why they're important or why they particularly touched you. So Ruth or Suzanne, whoever wants to go, is there a particular episode you'd like to share about?
I think part of like the beauty of Anah is how different each episode is. Like I almost like can't choose one because it's not a standalone thing. Not that the conversations follow on, but every one kind of adds to the picture. And it really, for me personally, it just makes me even more attached and more passionate about the country coming through the other side and being better. There's ones that when we're with them, when we're talking to them, you just like, it's so warm and you really get a sense of the person, and I've cried in a few as well. And then there's others that when I listen back to, I'm like, I didn't fully realize how good this was when I was involved in it, and how much I'm learning from this. So I just, Susan, I can't choose a person. So I'm sorry. I recommend listening to all the episodes. I don't know whether you've got a better answer, Suzanne.
I don't have a favorite, but if I was asking someone to kind of step into the podcast for the first time, especially if you're not into podcasts and getting a sense of it, I think Jiao Pao is a pretty good episode. It was a lovely episode to do, and given the darkness of our topic and what's actually happening, I laughed so much in that episode, which is a testament to his character, really. He's such a fun guy, and is such a role model, I think, as well. I think in terms of Tomorrow's episode, John Sifton, is an excellent one in terms of understanding sanctions. For anyone who is involved in activism anywhere in the world on Myanmar should listen to that episode and really get your head around it. He's got a wealth of knowledge. He gives it in very much simple terms, which is what we requested, because we wanted it to be as accessible to people as possible. So I think it's an important episode in terms of the importance of placing those sanctions on Mogi, Myanmar Oil and Gas. And I think John has the expertise. You know, I've heard so many people give silly reasons, and I gave all those to John, and he completely had an answer for all of it. So I think that's an important one. There's an up and coming one by a young girl, Tet, who is a social media activist. I think that's a phenomenal episode. She is an incredible young woman. And I think it's the freshest one in my mind because we've just been editing it. Mong's Arnie's is a pretty good episode too. It's a long one, and that will tell you how good it is. We didn't want to cut any of it, even though we cut a lot because it was a very long conversation. He was one of those surprise guests who I'd heard so many things about him. And people were like, oh, don't have him on your show. He's too controversial. But he was one of those really gems when we met him. Like, I really liked him. And yeah, he's mouthy and he's ballsy in the things he says, but he's a genuinely, good person. And that was the sense we got of him. And he was a wealth of knowledge. Oh my goodness. We learned so much in that episode. Aka's episode, a young man, 21 years of age with his brothers, his incredible story of like leaving Thailand to go back into Myanmar and illegally crossing the border to go in and find out what was happening. And again, he'd no intentions of joining the protests. He'd no intention of joining the resistance. And then everywhere he went and what he saw, compelled him further and further to get involved. And I just think I found it was a very sad episode in many ways. I think it was, a difficult one in that regard, but he's an incredible guy as well. Nathan Mong. I love Nathan after that episode. He's a very inspiring person. And again, just such a positive person when you think of the torture and the things he's been through. You don't have to listen to them in any order. Although Nay, our very first one, is a good starting point, I do think. He's got great knowledge and he's got a really great way of getting it across in a kind of respectful manner that people are open to listening. There's some fierier episodes. I mean, I think actually Christine's episode, I actually had a Burmese friend message me about a week ago, said, I'm listening to Christine's episode and I'm so angry with this woman. I'm so mad. She was like, and she said, when she said, Aung San Suu Kyi deserves to be in prison, I swore in my workplace, and by the end, she messaged me and said, it's okay. I've listened to the whole episode now. She is a good person. I forgive her. Thank you. And I thought, isn't that the beauty of what we're doing? If at the end of an episode, that is the reaction you have, that you understand somebody else's perspective. And she understood Christine's anger and hurt for what's happened to people. And that was quite a good moment to get a message like that.
That's a really great overview and some recommendations that I keenly urge listeners to go and check out since they're already on a podcasting app. And you've mentioned there some names of people who were recently, radicalized by this injustice and never expected to have this happen to them, to have these opinions about the Tatmadaw. And you've also mentioned some real veteran dissidents there. So you've had guests that have been opposing the military or engaging and then opposing for decades, as well as these new Generation Z voices. And you've also mentioned how much you feel like you've learned when you've done these interviews. So I wanted to ask you, after 15 interviews with these guests, how have your political opinions changed about the coup, about the anti-coup resistance? Have you changed your mind about anything from when you began to where you are today?
In terms of my own personal beliefs, I've always previously been, there's no point in violence. Violence isn't the answer, kind of. And I'm not by any means promoting violence, but I do, after seeing what the people have been through, I can understand more why sometimes it's needed. Not that I want any escalation in violence or I just want everyone to be okay, but it has changed my own personal ideas about it's never the right people on the front line, and that has always been why I've been anti-violent. violence, but there's old men being beaten to death, there's children like being shot. It's just so horrendous that I think any kind of retaliation or defense is very much something that needs to happen.
I think definitely my mind changes all the time. I go into an episode with my own kind of understanding of Myanmar, and I come out with a different one every time. And I think that we all should, we should listen to people and then try to inform ourselves. But I think the thing that I've learned the most, or that my eyes have been open to more, is that so many people have agendas. Like, somebody writing a newspaper article is getting paid to write that article. It doesn't matter if they're Western, doesn't matter if they're Burmese. It's a salary, it's a job. The same with politicians, they've got trade relations, they've got, their own agendas. And I think that was the one thing with the podcast, because I've obviously been working with different advocacy groups when I first came back behind the scenes, and no one could agree on a lot of things. And I found that really frustrating. And then I was like, why can't we agree on this? Like, this is a very simple thing, like sanction, Myanmar oil and gas. Why is that? Like, this is a non-violent, perfect solution to me, made total rational sense. And when you start looking closer at people, why would they be saying this? What is their, have they got a business interest? Do their family or extended family have a business interest that is benefiting from these things? So I think I'm definitely looking at people a little bit closer. Who are the people saying this? Is at the moment you hear it with the garment workers. When I speak to people on the ground who are garment workers, they're saying, look, we know we're going to starve. We know we're going to have no income, but we want this military out. And this is part of this wider strategy that we have. And then you have these businesses saying, oh, no, you can't do that. They'll all be forced into, starvation and prostitution. So I think I've started to look at who's saying what and who would benefit from either scenario. So that's something I've been learning to do more. And I think for us with the podcast, because it's not our careers. We have jobs, we have other careers. This is a side thing we're doing on a voluntary basis. Nobody gets any money for this. We don't have any advertising. Nobody has a stake in this. We have the final decision on what we do. So we have no agenda. What have we got to gain here as people? Absolutely nothing other than to help Myanmar. So I think in that sense, we have a responsibility to hear as many different voices as possible and to not be fixed in our own minds of what's right and what's wrong or what's the best for Myanmar, and try to, as much as possible, listen to the voices on the ground and amplify those voices, because whatever happens in Myanmar's future is not really going to impact ours too much, but it's going to have huge implications for the people of Myanmar. So just trying to not be fixed in our thoughts and to allow room for, I guess, our minds to be changed and often, as things change. And I would agree with Ruth as well. And not that I'm pro defense or like a violent resistance, but that it's very easy to preach that, non-violence from the other side. It's very easy for people in the West to say that to people in Myanmar, but they are not suffering at the rate the people in Myanmar are right now. And I think there's definitely a lack of compassion from a lot of diplomats, a lot of politicians in the West, when they say things like this, like, oh, non-violence is the way. Well, then why are you not sanctioning Mogi? Because that's a non-violent way you could help. So I don't buy it. It doesn't suit them. I mean, I think a lot of the politicians in the West would prefer if this all just went away and everyone just accepted this regime change and got on with things and we all got back to business. And I feel like it's unsettling for them that the Myanmar people are resisting so fiercely. And I think they will continue to resist. And I think that I have a lot of hope for the revolution. And I think there's a lot of movement happening on the ground. And the people we're talking to, there's some very positive developments, but the West keeps saying, oh, no, they're outnumbered. This, I guess the narrative they're selling is very different from what we're hearing on the ground. So I think it just doesn't suit the West to want to deal with the Myanmar situation. I mean, they'll talk about Afghanistan, they'll talk about Libya, but no one wants to talk about Myanmar. And I'd like to ask why. I mean, I'm not a journalist, I'm not a researcher, but if someone has that information, I want to know why there's so much silence around Myanmar as a country. It's just non-existent. And when you think of what's happening, with, like Ruth mentioned there, like children being shot, I mean, innocent people in prison, nobody seems to care in the Western world. Why? And as we said, our intention was to fill the gap. The media weren't speaking about Myanmar, but all we want is the media to talk about it so that people know about it. So if we can get people talking about Myanmar without the media, then we've done the job essentially either way. So just encourage people to listen and keep talking about Myanmar, because for some reason there seems to be a cloak of silence around Myanmar in the international community. And I'm not sure what that reason is, and whether it's financial incentives, whether it's business moves, whether people just don't feel they can solve that, so they don't want to even get their hands dirty. But it's really frustrating. And I think the one thing I'm noticing from Myanmar, okay, I've never been involved in anything like this before, but it took for obviously something to happen to the people I care about, and, you know, for me to be moved and to start paying attention. But once your eyes are open, you start seeing what's happening in other countries. And I think that what's happening in Myanmar, people should be paying attention to it. I think it's a very dangerous thing that, you know, somebody can come in, completely take over a country, kill politicians, put everyone in prison, kill doctors, teachers, like just completely dismantle a whole society, and that the world is just silent. I think that's an incredibly scary thing if we actually give that some thought. So I think for our own sakes in our own countries, and to hold on to democracy around the world, people should really, really be paying attention to Myanmar, because if they get away with this, the military there, what message is that sending to people who might be having thoughts similar in other countries in the world? So I think it's a bigger global problem than people maybe would like to admit. So yeah, I think it's pay attention to Myanmar now, or be Myanmar later.
So, as I said before, I think your show is terrific. I love what you're doing, and I recommend all of our listeners to go straight onto your podcast app, type in Anah, and the way that it's spelled is AH_NAH, and check out the Conversations with Myanmar podcast with these two great episodes coming up on sanctions and...
Tet, she's a social media activist, more so on Instagram. Yeah.
Fantastic, an Instagram activist. Now, before we finish up, we always ask our guests on Myanmar Musings to recommend something for our audience. It can be anything to do with Myanmar. You might choose to recommend something that helped you fall in love with the country, or you might want to recommend an activist program or something like that. It's completely up to you. Ruth, have you got anything to recommend for the audience?
One of the big ways that I fell in love with the country was the Myanmar sport Letway. And yeah, it's not a great follow-up, since I also just said I've changed my views on violence. But I just found it fantastic training, brilliant trainers, and went to like local fights and stuff. And it's such a part of the culture. I really like the way that empowered females as well, and that girls trained equally alongside men. So for me, it was a way of getting involved in the different side of the culture that I wasn't really exposed to otherwise. And yeah, I really miss it, and I miss training that way. So if the country opens up again and you go as a tourist or anything, like, try that sport. That would be my recommendation.
I'm envious. I never went to a Lethwei bout, or let alone trained in it. So that's a good recommendation for me as well. And Suzanne, how about you?
Our shows go out every Monday, and the day after we usually promote something to do with the guests. So I would recommend people to check out those posts, because that's our way. That's the kind of educational side of what we're doing. We usually have a bit where we would say, you know, if you want to know more about this organization or this group, I know Meredith Bunn, who we had in, I think, episode 5, Skills for Humanity is a fantastic organization. I know numerous people who work at that organization and volunteer their time. So there's loads of organizations like that. And I would just encourage people to donate. I cannot stress how much people in Myanmar need money, and it's getting on the ground. I can absolutely vouch for that. I mean, we're getting money to people, like, we're supporting people on a very personal level, but you can get money into the country and they need it. Like, we're so worried about starvation. We're so worried about what lies ahead. Please do donate, and to smaller organizations who are reaching people in very hard to reach areas in very remote parts of the country. A lot of big organizations, you know, a lot of that money gets eaten up by costs and staff costs. So like, we're trying to bypass some of that and just get it straight to the ground as much as possible. So yeah, I would really encourage people to donate where possible, do fundraisers where they are as well, anything that can help. But if you check out our social media pages, you'll see those different groups and organizations that we're recommending all the time.
Okay, thank you for those excellent recommendations. And the Anah Facebook page has all of that waiting there. And great to mention again that there are new episodes every Monday on your podcast, which I think I've recommended enough. So thank you very much to the both of you for coming onto Myanmar Musings to talk about the Anah Conversations with Myanmar podcast. And thank you for your passion in putting the podcast together and getting all these voices out there and keeping the conversation going. So thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Luke.
Yeah, thanks.